Well, hello and welcome to this EFPIA event entitled Bend But Don't Break, Future-Proofing the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. Well, how timely this is, of course, because the pandemic has tested Europe's medicine supply chain like never before. It's affected manufacturing, trade, logistics, and of course, ultimately, patient access to medicines. We've seen shortages of active pharmaceutical ingredients. We've seen stockpiling of medicines, as well as things like extreme weather conditions disrupting distribution, and also shortages of critical workers and other factors which have created something of a perfect storm for the global supply chain. Well, keeping up with fluctuating demand can be challenging at the best of times. So what has been learnt from this pandemic? How can the resilience and the efficiency of supply chains better be enhanced and ensured? Well, with us to address some of these questions, we have an excellent panel of speakers, and you'll be able to put your questions to them. You can use the question Q&A function on your screens. If you have any other issues like technical, use the chat function, but please do submit your Q&A questions. We look forward to putting those to the panel later on in this 55-minute, rather brief session to cover such an important topic. The event is being recorded and it will be available later on replay on the EFPIA YouTube channel. You can promote it on social media using the hashtag #WeWon'tRest. My name is Sue Saville. I'm an independent health journalist, and I'm delighted to be guiding these discussions today. And very pleased now to introduce to you Radu Ganescu, who is the president of the National Coalition of Organizations of Patients with Chronic Conditions of Romania, known as COPAC, also the vice president of the European Patients Forum, EPF. So Radu, welcome to you, and over to you to set the scene for us now.
Hello, and thank you. And hello, everyone that are participating here. Thank you to be here. And I'm delighted to point some discussion subject. So indeed, COVID-19 affect the supply chain. And like you say, in the end, they affect the patient and the citizen of European citizens. That leads to a lacking sustainability, which leads to various crises for different reasons. Where we're talking about logistics, or we're talking about production or distribution, we can put here also different health system with different regulation, and we know that this can be a problem in the supply chain. The pandemic has shown us what we do. We are not yet prepared, and we need more information. We need more coverage, ethical coverage in the European Union. For example, raw material and manufacturing are very important and part of the supply chain, and it shows us in this period that when we are depending on the certain industry or a certain region like Asia continent, can be in danger our stability of production and can go to different shortages. So we have the example of medical equipment that happened in this period, and a lot of medical staff didn't have the material to work with the patients. Another example that maybe we can improve it in the future and show us that the collection of the blood plasma, it's now becoming the issue because we are depending about United States. And I think we preferably want to have voluntary, non-remunerated donors here in the European Union. And this dependency rate is quite high. And I think it's a relevant topic to discuss in the coming years about this subject, because we will have EU blood directive. So it's important to approach the subject. One of the known things that we have here as a patients, we have different shortages in the past years, and not only because of pandemic. This kind of stuff is happening before the pandemic, and I think we need to prepare better in order to understand what solution we need to do. we have some countries in Europe that apply a digital solution. Maybe it's one of the things that we can discuss about e-prescription, teleconsultation, but unfortunately the access is unequal. And the study already suggests that this disruption may result in thousands of excess deaths and morbidity. So it's nothing new what I say now, but the patients need treatment in the right moment, at the right time, and in the right amount. And this kind of problems that happen in the pandemic show us that maybe we need to improve many things. So practically the patients are not very interesting about the causes that make these disruptions, but we are interested in the solution, and we are. This doesn't mean that we don't want to be actively participating, discover the real solution at the micro level, of course, and make the big solution at the macro level. So because of this, as a patient organization, we always can have the information, and we always can put our organization to work with every stakeholder. And of course, we can make and assure an effective communication with our patients. So as a member of APF, APF fully supports stronger EU cooperation on assessment of value, cost-effective pricing, reimbursement, procurement, and in addition, we strongly support action to increase transparency in sector. So I think I just put some points over here. It's important to have this debate, and it's important to think about the future, to think about the future of our patients, of our citizens, and we as an organization will always be here to support that. So thank you, and I think it's will be a great discussion today, and maybe not the last one, maybe the first one.
Radu, thank you very much indeed. And as you say, it's not new that we have shortages, and you highlight as well equipment, not just medicines. Thank you very much for giving us that overview. Do stay with us, Radu, for the questions coming up later and our conclusions at the end. I'd be interested to hear what you make of it all. And as you say, the patient isn't so interested in the causes, but the solutions. And I think we're going to touch on both of those. So let's now meet our esteemed panel of speakers to find out how we can future-proof the pharmaceutical supply chain. We're delighted to have with us, cameras on and microphones on, please, panel. We have Sylvain Giraud, who is the head of unit with medical products concerned about quality, safety, innovation at DG SANTE of the European Commission. We also have Domenico Di Giorgio, who is the director at the Italian Medicines Agency known as AIFA. And also Marco Farinelli, supply chain manager at AstraZeneca and chair of the supply chain working group for EFPIA. Welcome to you all. We also have apologies from MEP Dolores Montserrat, who very much wanted to be with us today, but she has parliamentary business at the European Parliament and sends her apologies. So perhaps to start with, again, to get an overview of your positions, it'd be really useful to hear from each of you in turn. What is your take on the key issues in supply chain resilience? Sylvain Giraud, perhaps I could turn to you first.
Thank you, Sue. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us, or me, to join this interesting conversation. Thank you also to Radu, because he said already a lot of very, very important things in his introduction. You know, what is the biggest challenge we face? And this is something Radu said already. I think it's the challenge of information, the challenge of knowledge, the challenge of evidence to base a good policy making. I'm speaking, of course, from the point of view of public authorities here. There is an article in the legislation that says that the market authorization holders are obliged to ensure appropriate and continuous supply. But the reality is that, as it has already been said, we are facing systemic shortages situation, and we're facing, not only during crisis, even in time of peace, if I may say, we're facing situation where patients and health professionals, health systems generally, are not supplied with the product that they would need to have. So this is a very critical situation that has been already mentioned many, many times, even before the crisis. And what we're facing is a lack of understanding, a lack of information, a lack of knowledge about what are the driving factors for that. It's because the supply chains have become extremely complicated, many multiple actors, many multiple steps, and increasingly globalized with a certain number of vulnerabilities, dependencies that sometimes are difficult to map, are difficult to understand. And this is what the Commission said we would do, we would want to do together with member states, with the stakeholders in the pharma strategy. And we've launched a certain number of initiatives, including yesterday we published a study on the root causes of shortages and how that could be factored into the revision of the pharma legislation. So I stop there and we can come back to some of the actions the Commission is proposing.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much indeed, Sylvain. It'd be really interesting to get the exclusive top line news on your latest publication on that. But first, let me turn now to Domenico for your overview of the situation.
Yes, thank you. The AIFA started working from a scientific point of view on the short supply of medicines from many years, and we were forced to face the different challenges of this issue, since we had plenty of general press information regarding the short supply of some specific medicines that were not covered by the regulation that was already mentioned. We noted that we had different issues related to the short supply that were mixed up in the general press report and even in the complaints and in the studies that we received from the field. But one of the problems was that the issues that we were facing were not always covered by the competence of the agency, because if you are lacking the supply of a specific medicine, it may be for an issue related to manufacturing, that's in the duties of the drug regulatory agency, but it could also be related to other issues like the ones in connection with distribution, that's not always under the competence of the DRA. Moreover, we noted that in the general press mix-up, also the difficulties in tenders related to hospitals were considered as a shortage issue, but it was another kind of problem related to the let's say the resiliency of the distribution network with respect to the rules for the supply to hospitals. So we know that short supply is a symptom, and we set up, since the symptom is affecting the patients, and it makes no sense to say that it's not in our duty to work on distribution. We set up systems for having all of the competent authorities and private stakeholders cooperating for facing the different root causes of short supply, considering the disease and not the symptom. So this scientific approach was proven to be effective, and during the pandemic, Italy was one of the countries that better faced the risk of short supply. And so we are really happy that the Commission is working in, let's say, fostering the cooperation and using the best practices that member states develop. It is, I think, the right road for getting out of this kind of issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear there about your experience, and perhaps we'll share a bit more about those best practices. Marco Farinelli, what's your take on the key issues about supply chain resilience?
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for inviting me today. First of all, so I was hearing so far important elements of supply chain resilience. First of all, let me highlight, yes, definitely the pandemic had a role in putting supply chain resilience under the spotlight. So there is no doubt how supply chain resilience is important for patients and societies. That needs to be a bit the shared objective that we all have here. I've heard about information sharing as an important element, and I've heard about risks. And there are risks, of course, in the supply chain of medicines, and we have seen some of those risks coming through in a negative way during the pandemic that led to shortages, or also before. But then we had a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. We also had cases where risk was successfully managed, and at the end, patients continued to be supplied despite a dramatic change in the overall ecosystem. Demand has changed. There were limitations on on workers moving, for example, within borders and across borders. A little bit of a crumble of the logistics services at the very first stages. So there were both cases of good resilience and where resilience can be improved. So resilience is definitely under the right spotlight here. And I think one of the keys to unlock the next level of supply chain resilience, because I have said we don't need to throw out the baby with the bad water, in a way, in this case, is really working together on information sharing on one side, leveraging as much as possible digital initiatives that we see growing in the EU. I just want to mention very briefly the European Medicines Verification System, or traceability systems in general. There can be a way to share information across the supply chain. Of course, this doesn't need to replace at all voluntary voluntary notifications from marketing authorization holders, but is more a complementary aspect and a new aspect we could explore. When it comes to risk, I think what the pandemic has taught us is what can we do with more collaboration on risk management. This is what happened during the pandemic. We provided more information, more visibility. We have worked closely with regulators. We started to work together on risk mitigations, and I think we can work together also on risk prevention. Honestly, this wants to be one of the proposals. For example, we have heard several times the importance of business continuity plans or shortage prevention plans, as they are also known. Potentially, they can be a new tool to share more information around our supply chain, especially with regulators, so that a shared risk management approach can be designed, and then the adequate policies the adequate measures in the supply chain can follow, because not every medicine needs the same intervention. There are medicines that will need more inventory, for example. More inventory maybe at API level or at bulk level. Other medicines will require a second source, for instance. But it really needs to be based on a risk-based approach to be the most effective and successful. Thank you.
Well, thank you each very much indeed for setting out your stalls there. And please, may I remind the audience, we want your questions. You have a fabulous panel here to quiz. It's your opportunity to put your questions to them. So do pop those in the Q&A function and we'll come to those and take as many as we can. But meanwhile, I just want to tease out a little bit more from that. Sylvain, you were saying there about the study that was published just yesterday into the root causes, and the European Commission has, of course, had many initiatives looking into the causes, the vulnerabilities of supply chains. What are your key insights, and where do you see the role of the European Commission and indeed the EU's pharmaceutical strategy in tackling this?
Thank you. No, it's very interesting to hear what Marco was saying and the different solutions that the industry is thinking of. I think this is very important indeed that the industry does that. I think public authorities, in fact, very much trust that industry will assume the obligations that legal obligations, but also responsibility from a socially responsible industry to ensure the security of supply and to develop reliable and robust supply chains and to address some of the issues, whether they are in times of crisis or whether they are more systemic, to ensure that there is a continuity of supply and security of supply, and to ensure also the necessary coordination within their commercial supply chain, within the different industries that are involved, because it's a very complex process. We are aware of that. But we also recognize that there is a role for a cooperation between the national authorities. And in fact, the national authorities have realized that they need to, as I think Domenico said, they are facing a situation where they don't well have the knowledge or the competence or the capacity or the information to be taking measures. And ultimately, they are the ones that have to face the difficulties in terms of public health. So they are the ones that need also to put in place a certain number of measures. So what we're saying in the pharma strategy is that we need to be looking at this from two angles. One is the management of shortages situation, whether systemic or crisis related, and we have already put a certain number of tools in place. In particular, for the time of crisis, we've reinforced the mandate of EMA, and through EMA and the network of national authorities, national competent authorities, national agencies for medicines, through that network, we've now developed, because we have also learned from the crisis, tools to work together and address some crisis situation. We've also created a new authority that is going to be specifically responsible for crisis management, including in relation to shortages and supply security of key medical products. This is HERA, you've heard about that. And this is also an action in that context. So that's the first set of actions. The second set, I think, is the revision of the legislation. We have announced in the strategy that we will revise the legislation. And in fact, we have said I read from the strategy here, the Commission will propose to revise the pharmaceutical legislation to enhance security and address shortages through specific measures, including stronger obligations of supply and transparency, earlier notification of shortages and withdrawal, enhanced transparency of stocks, and stronger EU coordination and mechanisms, etc. So from what I heard from Marco, I think I understand that these are also the kind of measures that the industry is prepared to work with, and this includes indeed the type of things he's talking about in terms of management plan, risk assessment, earlier information, and so on. So that's the second set, if you want. There is a third set. I said there would be two, but there's a third one, which is cooperation on supply chain security from a more global point of view. And on that, we have set a process that we call the structured dialogue, where we brought together the national authorities and the stakeholders to discuss and try to understand better, document better, map better those vulnerabilities, try to answer the questions: what is a robust supply chain? What are the criteria that make them vulnerable? How do we assess dependencies? Are dependencies from a country a problem or not? What are the conditions for it not to be a problem? I mean, we've had millions of, well, not millions, but quite a few questions that the Commission asked to the participants in this conversation. And we only got, we got a good feedback, but probably we were a bit disappointed by the information we got, in the way that we don't feel that we now have a very strong body of evidence as to what the actions needed to be done. In parallel, we were developing this study, or we were commissioning this study, which I mentioned and which was published yesterday, which is looking specifically also at certain of these aspects, including the revision of the legislation. And the consultant, I have to emphasize that this is done externally by a consultant that has worked independently. So everything they said do not necessarily reflect the views of the European Commission. But this consultant has done the work and has actually relied on a lot of consultation, discussions, workshops, and different consultation mechanism. They're making a series of 16 recommendations, which in a way also reflect what a certain number of things that we've been saying in the pharmaceutical strategy in November last year, and that we've been started to implement and discuss and work together. I want to say that this is something that is very, very much a multi-level policy making between member states and the EU level. There are things we can do together at the EU level, and there are things that are also national policy making. And we need to make sure through the European tools that we can also support and accompany the national policy making.
Sylvain, thank you. And let's put that straight over to Domenico. You talk about the national authorities and what their competencies are and their role in this. Domenico, what tools do you need as a national authority in order to enhance the supply chains? And you made the point yourself, the distinction between what the shortages are, where they are, whether it's manufacturing or distribution.
I think that during the 2020 crisis, we had good support from the Commission with respect to joint procurement, for instance, because it was a very good tool for some specific products that were under short supply and that were not considered before as a possible crisis point. So ICU medicines are a good example. We already have in Italy a similar tool for similar tools for managing this kind of crisis. So we have centralized the procedure for importing medicines from abroad, for instance, in case of shortages. And we also have emergency plans for state manufacturing of some key products. But having the Europe supporting the member states this way by looking for these short supply medicines in third countries was really effective, also because it was again a good way for duplicating some of the good practices that member states were putting in operation during this crisis. So we had member states coordinating the field structures like Italy did for avoiding duplication in requests and optimizing the use of available resources at field level. As you know, and I can also answer to one of the questions that I noted in the meantime, that Italy had a traceability system in place since 2005. So we use at the state level traceability data for checking for protecting the distribution network, but also for noting the movement of key products, so that we are using this information in a very restricted way without interfering with the competition between companies, but having an eye to the risk of short supply of critical medicines. Using the different tools that we have available is clearly an added value, and learning from the experience of other countries is also relevant. From this point of view, the role of Europe is critical because the Commission supported member states in sharing good practices, and in the study that was already mentioned, there are also the country fish related to the good practices that are available in the different member states that will be published, I think, during this week, that are a very good source for inspiration for the member states in setting up policies. So there are many different roles, from the practical one, supporting with the joint procurement, to the, let's say, scientific ones, giving scientific basis for working together, that are up to the European authorities, and we are happy to see that we can work together this way.
Thank you. And turning to Marco now, from an industry perspective, what would you say actually constitutes a strong supply chain? How did the industry cope and avoid worse shortages during COVID?
Yeah, I think there were two elements, with the risk of repeating myself, but the work around information sharing and the support that only an authority could give, conscious that we need to adhere, we don't need to distort competition, was key. So we need to play our part with information sharing, and then authorities can help to tackle where there is an actual need of a product, and that's in a way the transparency that we are missing at this stage. What I want to highlight is it is also very important to have the right focus. So all this needs to be managed through a clear risk assessment exercise that is done upfront. With COVID, of course, that exercise was done very early on. Sort of a critical medicines list was identified, and then focus and work on supply chain resilience has been put on those specific products. Now, we cannot work under emergency all times, but definitely the concept of a list of criticalities, a list of vulnerabilities, for example, or products that are at higher risk that we need to address can be sort of a business as usual approach to take, where where to provide additional information, where to put the focus as a supply chain. The other element I would bring, and maybe is also linked to one of the questions I have seen coming through, is around the role of global supply chains. Again, we have seen a mixed bag there. There were examples of where global supply chains don't help, and though in that case we do have a vulnerability that needs to be addressed. But in other cases, actually, global supply chains have helped us to more quickly recover from a potential shortage risk and to mitigate that. And also, let's be aware that for certain medicines or vaccines, we in a way we cannot avoid a globalized supply chain. So sometimes we don't have, as manufacturers, the luxury of choice. In a way, we need to we need to tap into specific technologies, specific capabilities, and in that case, looking at the broader global environment, it's a resource for us rather than a risk. So in a way, we are definitely happy with a strong European footprint when it comes to manufacturing, and to have as European manufacturers, capabilities and technologies close to home in a way, but we also need to make sure we leverage on the strengths of global supply chains, where there are strengths in the global supply chain, of course. And then maybe the last element when it comes to global supply chain is also maybe working also with some of our trade partners, especially those where we have mutual recognition, because of course we have very valuable and capable trade partners, even inside, right at the heart of Europe, for example. So I think that also needs to be acknowledged.
Thank you. Gosh, a lot covered there. A couple more things I want to put to you, and then we will go to the questions that are coming in, and thank you for putting all of those. And if I could ask our speakers perhaps to be quite concise now in answers, so we can crack through as many of the questions as possible. Sylvain, to pick up on a couple of the points there, Marco saying that there's a need then to keep that diversity of the global supply chain, but also to make sure that Europe is strong. It is a strong Europe, a strong ecosystem in Europe, actually essential in terms of investment there, investment in terms of R&D, making sure that Europe is a strong place, so that where Marco was describing about reshoring, the bringing back of things into the supply chain in Europe, if you've got a strong system in Europe, that's going to be your good base. Sylvain.
Yes, no, but certainly I agree with all this. This is what we're saying also in the pharmaceutical strategy. I mean, we in the Commission, we've always been, at least at technical level, I have to say, quite prudent about this concept of reshoring. And in fact, we've always thought that what is important is not reshoring for reshoring. From the point of view of public health authorities, what is important is to end systemic shortages. So if some reshoring is an answer to that objective, because it makes sense, because it has been demonstrated by evidence-based policy making, that is a useful action, yes. But we're looking at this from the point of view of a public health objective. Of course, it can be combined with other policy objectives, and it has to be combined with other policy objectives, including industrial policy objectives and objectives that are relating to the competitiveness of the industry. And all these different objectives have to be looked at it together. And this is the holistic approach we propose in the strategy and the one we follow. I think, it's very important the things that Marco said that the industry would want to see, in particular in relation to a system that would allow for competitors to talk together within a comfortable, within a sort of comfort zone that would be cleared with competition authorities. I mean, you know that the Commission is open to that, and we have discussed, we've done something like this during the pandemics, and there are possibilities for that. So I think it would be useful that you share with us what exactly you're looking for and what exactly you'd like to see. Same thing in relation to you said we need a clear risk assessment exercise. Yeah, I think this is what we, in a way, unless I misunderstood you, but from what you said, what you described as the need for a clear risk assessment exercise is exactly what we wanted to do and still probably want to do and need to do with the structured dialogue phase 1. But the reality is that, to be very frank with you, we were a bit disappointed by the quality of the information, the granularity of the information we were getting from the industry players. So if we want to really do this risk assessment, we will have to go one step further in how we share information. And this is, I think, an important thing to say.
Thank you. And let's put that then to Marco to respond to. Is industry doing enough then, playing its part? I mean, perhaps there's something more that could be done in terms of better use of the existing national and European medicines verification systems, collaboration on a wider scale, Marco?
Yeah, definitely. So I think Sylvain is pointing out right on the spot, some of the limitations we have seen during the structured dialogue. Okay, so but I think it's a process, that we started with the structured dialogue. So I also agree. Was the information granular enough for you to have a clear understanding of where the vulnerabilities are? Probably not. We were more at a principle level there, but I think a next step can come. I mean, recently I have seen, for example, the study that has been published by DG Grow in the Commission around vulnerabilities. I think that's a very good example of how we are trying to move to the next step, trying to identify clearly the areas of risk. And then, of course, we can continue working on there to make it more tangible and pragmatic, because at the end of the day, we need to try to foster this risk-based approach in our view. During the structured dialogue, we started to do that, especially in work stream 2. I think we have seen some very important and good work coming through on some potential principles on how to do that, but it's something new. So in a way, we need to learn from work and understand how to best move forward on these, basically. But yeah, definitely, if I can reiterate, information sharing / transparency and working on on risk management together is, for us, it definitely holds the keys to unlock a better level of supply chain resilience. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got some great questions coming in. Let's take some of these now from our audience. One here saying, a question for Sylvain. We hear that the Commission considers supplier obligations or distributor obligations are important to reduce shortages, but an increasing body of evidence points to market failure. So will the Commission also legislate on market failures? Perhaps briefly, Sylvain, what's your response to that one?
Well, I'm sorry, maybe I miss a point, but I'm not sure what would be legislating on market failure. I mean, what exactly that would mean? I'm not very clear. I think for us anyway, legislation, and in particular, the type of measures I listed that the strategy mentions and that have been also reviewed through the study, it's only one aspect of the way we think we should address the situation. I mean, Reinforcing obligations in the legislation. I'm not sure this is the answer, because there is already an article in the legislation that says that there is an obligation to supply, and despite this obligation, there are problems. So I mean, we can always put all the legislation. You can forbid people to park on pavement, and they still park on pavement. So there is a limit to what can be done with the legislation. There are other actions in terms of collaboration, in terms of cooperation, in terms of other tools like public procurement, how public procurement can be developed in a way that is actually supports security of supply, how we work globally. Marco mentioned that. How do we work globally with our partners, our trade partners, but also globally in global forums on quality standards, on developing level playing field. I mean, these are elements that we mentioned in the strategy, and there are definitely also the panoply of instruments that are useful for intensifying the security of supply chain. There are also others in terms, how do we reward companies or sectors that go beyond the legislative requirements in greening manufacturing, in greening, in modernizing their production process? How do we reward those that are taking socially responsible actions in relation to the way they produce in other parts of the world, where the social and environmental standards are much lower? I mean, there are many ways that we can look at these things, and we're open to look at all the different policy. But I want to insist on one thing, is that, the panoply of instruments, we kind of know. Of course, there's also public money. I should mention that, because, yeah, public money, subsidies, state aid, yes, of course, it's there too. But that it also needs to be a good use of public money. So all these instruments are there, but it's not very difficult to map those instruments, and we've done that. What is difficult is to have the evidence on how to mobilize this instrument on the basis of what we know the problem is. And this is a bit the challenge we're facing at the moment.
Thank you. Another question that's come in, Marco, you touched on the need for a critical medicines list. Could you just briefly talk about, is that needed at a European level? Is it needed at a global level? And who defines what's critical?
Yeah, thank you. That I think this is a very good question. Okay, so I think a list of critical medicines, okay, which doesn't necessarily mean what is more. A medicine is more important than the other. That's not the concept, but looking at critical medicines list is usually what kind of medicines do I need to tackle a certain crisis, for example, like during COVID. So and then the list of critical medicines needs to look also at supply chain vulnerabilities. So if I need a product, but that supply chain is very robust, for example, that's going to be probably at a lower risk. So it's a way to really drive the focus of all stakeholders on working toward what is really needed. Okay, so where are the vulnerabilities? That depends, or of where is the criticality. That's the first step. Okay. To do that. Now, if it's EU or national, I think this is where probably we need to, we need to discover it a little bit. Of course, I mean, there could be market specificities on certain product registrations, for example, that we need to account for. But ideally, the more EU. Let's stop at EU level for a second, because global level brings another additional challenges. But an EU level list would definitely ensure we have a harmonized way of looking at things. But we still need to recognize there may be country specificities on this. So that is really the first step that would then allow us to focus and work on supply chain vulnerabilities, increasing transparency, really addressing the remit in a very pragmatic way. We have an issue, and we see how to fix it through transparency and the shared risk management approach.
Thank you. And another question that's come in, Domenico, I think this might be for you, because the point there Marco is making about what's done at EU level. A question's coming in about, while we're working on new EU legislation, some member states start proposing national legislation to manage the shortages. So the question is, how can we ensure to keep an EU approach to the common challenge that's faced?
That's I think in the previous part of our discussion, because the role of the Commission in supporting the sharing of good practices and to support the discussion between different stakeholders is some way granting this kind of coordination at EU level. Please consider that part of the issues that we are discussing are related to distribution, and distribution is nationally regulated. And so it is clear that the Commission have to support member states not in reinventing the wheel or in creating barriers against the market, for instance. So it is important always to consider that we should look at the problem in a global way. As it was mentioned, we should consider the dialogue between stakeholders and between member states and between regions and countries as the key for facing this issue. One of the points that we made during the 2020 crisis in Italy was that we wanted to avoid any ban for export. That was one of the tools that were discussed during the crisis, and we never did it, in spite of being one of the countries that had most part of product in, because we are the manufacturers, key manufacturers of ICU medicine. So propofol, for instance, is basically manufactured in Italy. We did not want to act in this way, because the better way for facing the short supply is to cooperate, not to create barriers. I can give you an example of the strategies that we put in place, and it's again on dialogue, that the kind of dialogue that the Commission is supporting. We know that we may have issues in the medium term with the plasma-derived product, with blood product. And so we started, as we are doing at national level since 2015, in general against short supply. We set up an ad hoc group of discussion with industries, patients association, regional authorities dealing with blood gathering, for discussing the different possible policies that we have for limiting the impact of this forthcoming short supply. It means that we may act on economic incentives as industry is proposing. We can work on strengthening the blood gathering, supporting the regions in their gathering exercises. We can support industries in strengthening their manufacturing lines in order to have better production shares for the blood that we gather. And we also can develop policies at the ministry and agency level, guidelines for optimized use of these short supply products. It means that having all of the stakeholders around the same table gives you all of the available tools. You cannot look at these problems with a monodimensional approach, because you always have different stakeholders, private and public, and you have different approaches in different countries and regions. So we have to look at these issues as global problems, not with a local view. And I think that the Commission is in the right place for supporting member states in changing their view from the local to a more regional and global one.
Thank you. And let's we'll put that to Sylvain to respond on that. And the reference to the report that came out by the consultants Technopolis, they're talking about it's not, shortages are not so much necessarily of something that whether it's available, but where it's available. Sylvain, picking up then from Domenico's point about whether it should be a global perspective. Briefly, how much should Europe give a global perspective to this?
No, first I want to say that, Domenico explained very, very well, I think, the situation in how this is multi-level governance and how this needs to be addressed through a different level of government at national level. This is the reality we face in the EU. I mean, we have a system that, for very good reasons, very legitimate reasons, has some EU-level rules, but also national ones. And it's the product. We're not talking about any product, so the internal market is maybe different than it is for cars or for products like this. So they are, for very obvious reasons, a very strong national level that needs to be recognized, and that is very legitimate. And so, there's a certain number of things that can be done together. There's a certain number of things that can be done through EU-level legislation, but there's also a very high number of things that are done at national level through the national rules and the national regulatory context, and that is, I think, very legitimate. When you're talking about global, well, I think before I mentioned the need to integrate those dimensions and those challenges into the global policy, our global policy on medicines. And as I said, we want to continue to do that. I think the EU is, for example, a very important player with other parts of the world in ICH, the Global Forum for Standard Setting or Quasi-Standard Setting at global level. And this is something we need to continue. There's also something called PICS, which is a cooperation on inspections between authorities across the world. I mean, these are the kind of things we want to continue and reinforce the presence of the EU team, as we now say, member states and commission, in the way that we work on developing highest quality standards or higher quality standards across the world.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's put questions in. We have a very short session today and there isn't time to address them all, but some of them touch on the same sort of issues, looking outside Europe, looking how global we should be. So thank you so much for those. In the last few minutes, I'd like to ask each of our speakers and bring back Radu Ganescu here to also have a word with us about what you see as your concluding thoughts on this. Where could we go in terms of ensuring resilience within these supply chains? From what we've discussed today and the points that you've considered, perhaps Radu, just a word or two to sum up. What would you say from the discussions you've listened to?
I think if you ask me, it's clear that we need to work together. We need joint action. And if we want to have results, we need knowledge. And practically everyone here said about the information. We need to share this information. We need to share best practice and collaboration. Without that, it's impossible to resolve, to find solution, each one on his way. So working together, have the same common goals, and we need to emphasize that the medicine are not consumer goods like any others. Medicine are practically discussing about patient's life. So that's why it's important to have solution at national level as a member state and also as European level, because otherwise it's impossible to take tackling the problem and find solution. And I thank everyone here today that participated and being in this panel of discussion.
Thank you, Radu. Domenico, what's your sum thought? Where do you see the best solutions lying?
I think that the best way for addressing the issue is to set up together the basis for the discussion, the scientific basis. So dialogue, sharing best practices and fostering the European, in this case, and global approaches to the key issues. So the dialogue, just like we experimented in the last year, thanks to the many lines of action that the Commission set up, or also the multilateral dialogue that we have in place in Italy since 2015. Having all of the stakeholders around the same table means that we can look at the issue from the patient point of view, because as we mentioned during this discussion, this is the key point. we have to support the patients. And if you do not have all of the stakeholders around the same table, you cannot forecast what will happen, because ICU medicines are clearly not in the critical list of the patients association, because that's something that you can only use during emergencies. But if you have an open dialogue, you can also work on the forecasting things that are not easy to spot.
Thank you. Open dialogue. Briefly, Marco and then Sylvain, your very brief thoughts. What is the priority action to improve the situation, Marco?
Okay, so I go first. Maybe summing up, I would say priority actions are really continuing on what we have discovered through the work we have done together on COVID. So fostering and trying to develop that risk-based framework that we can work together on a harmonized approach across the EU, and then strengthen information sharing within this remit.
Thank you. Sylvain, briefly, priority action.
Well, this is what I started to say at the beginning. I mean, I would say priority action is knowledge development, evidence gathering. But I want to say that, you know, I also highlighted or alluded to a certain number of instruments. There are many instruments. And to put them in motion, we need to do the sort of impact assessment that we usually do, in a way that we need to understand what is the right answer to the specific types of problems we have.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all our speakers for those contributions. Thank you to EFPIA for organizing this event. Thank you to all the audience for your participation today and for the questions coming in. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I hope that's given you some food for thought. The event has been recorded and will be available later on the EFPIA YouTube channel to look back at and think about. My name's Sue Saville, and it's been my pleasure to guide these discussions today. Thank you all very much for joining us. Goodbye.